You only use 10% of your brain? That's pathetic. Yeah, we're left brain thinkers. You know, logic, mathematics, actual intelligence. Yeah, this isn't how intelligence works. The 10% brain power is wrong. The left brain versus right brain personality is wrong. And even IQ doesn't necessarily mean genius versus idiot. The actual level of a person's intelligence is a lot more complicated to measure. Because intelligence levels are complex, there have been many simple explanations to explain these levels. So without further ado, let's get on to debunking our first myth, which is that we only have 10% brain power. Which basically states we're walking around with 10% of our brain power, and if we could unlock more of our brain, we'd be geniuses. But this is completely false. When scientists actually look at the brain using modern imaging, things like fMRI scans that track blood flow and activity, the picture looks completely different from the 10% myth. Even completing simple actions light up multiple parts of the brain. Walking involves motor regions, balance systems in the cerebellum so you don't fall and trip on your nose, and sensory feedback, adjusting your movement. Talking is even more complex. Your brain has to pull words from memory, organize them into sentences, and control breathing and vocal cords all at the same time. Not to mention also paying attention to the people that you are talking with. This is why people get overstimulated when talking with people. And brain activity is constantly shifting based on what you're doing. Even when you are doing nothing, your brain is still active through something called default mode network. So the brain isn't exactly 10% is doing the work while the rest of the brain is waiting to be unlocked. Think of it more like a sports team. American football, for example. Every position has their own unique specialized role, depending on certain situations the game is in. The quarterback can't suddenly run onto the field and kick a 50-yard field goal. Your brain works the same way. Different regions step in depending on the task. The prefrontal cortex, for example, is heavily involved in planning, reasoning, and decision-making. But when you're asleep, it becomes much less active, while other systems like the hypothalamus, which regulates sleep cycles, and brainstem that controls breathing and heart rate, they take over. The brain is still working. It's just different players on the field depending on what's going on in the game. Evolution also tells us the 10% idea just doesn't make any sense. The brain is only 2% of our body weight, but it burns roughly 20% of the body's energy, which is pretty expensive. Nature wouldn't keep something around if 90% of it was doing nothing. And somehow this myth even got tied in with Albert Einstein. Motivational speakers love claiming that Einstein said we only use 10% of our brain. The problem is, he never said that. There's no evidence of this in his writings or his lectures. Somehow one of the most intellectual physicists of all time became the pioneer for one of the most ignorant brain myths. The truth is, we use almost all of our brain, just not at the same time. Our next myth is IQ determines how smart you are. When people hear IQ, they assume this means intelligence. A high IQ means you're a genius. Average IQ means you're just normal. And a low IQ means you're unlucky. Simple as that. Except intelligence isn't that simple. IQ tests measure something psychologists call general intelligence, often written as G. And researchers noticed a pattern. Typically, people who do well on one type of mental task often do well in others. But the thing is, intelligence is a lot more complicated than just a single score. There are many factors that play into how intelligent someone actually is. History also gives us example why IQ doesn't explain the full story. Albert Einstein, for example, he was recorded to have an IQ of 160. But this was recorded after his death, which is ironic. He's the symbol of high IQ equals genius, even though he never even took the test. And then we have physicist Richard Feynman, who was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, which since 1901, only 990 individuals have received this award. Think about the billion people that have been alive since 1901. And he was one of the most brilliant scientists of the 20th century. But his IQ was actually reported to be 125, which would be in the level of just above average, nowhere near the level of a genius. Our next myth is that confidence equals intelligence. Confidence is one of the best disguised as stupidity has invented. Someone speaks confidently and passionately, throws in a couple big words, and suddenly the whole room assumes they must be a genius. But there is an effect called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which basically says people that know very little about a subject often tend to be more confident in themselves. This was an experiment done in the 90s that tested people in areas on logic, grammar, and humor. What inspired psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger was the observation of a bank robbery in Pittsburgh, where the robber believed rubbing lemon juice on himself would make himself invisible to the cameras. After this experiment was done, the participants were asked to estimate their performance. What was found was the people that performed the worst on the test often overestimated their abilities versus the people that actually did the best and were a little bit more cautious with how they had ranked their performance. And the thing is experts tend to be more cautious because they understand how complicated information can be. The guy who watched a couple Tic Tacs and has spunk talks like he's a research expert ready to debate anybody involved in that specific field. The loudest voice in the room doesn't always indicate the smartest. The next myth is that you're either left-brained or you're right-brained. You probably heard this before. I'm left-brained, so I'm super-duper logical and mathematical. I'm actually right-brained, so I'm super-duper creative. Yes, the brain does have two hemispheres, and certain functions tend to lean towards one side of the brain. Language processing is often more active on the left side. Spatial awareness and visual processing are typically on the right side. But that doesn't mean people are left-brained or right-brained. In reality, almost everything you do involves both the left and right hemisphere of your brain. When you speak, the left side helps you organize words and grammar, while the right side helps interpret tone, emotion, and context. When you're solving a math problem, you are using logical reasoning, but you're also recognizing patterns. Writing a song, designing something, or telling a story involves planning, structure, and decision making, and those rely heavily on areas like the prefrontal cortex, which communicates across both hemispheres. The two hemispheres of your brain are constantly sharing information through a massive bundle of nerve fibers, which is called the corpus callosum. And if the left brain, right brain stereotype were true, then people like Leonardo da Vinci wouldn't make any sense. The same man who painted the Mona Lisa and created many other artistic masterpieces was also designing flying machines centuries ahead of their time, studying human anatomy, and filling up notebooks with engineering sketches. Art and science weren't two different personalities inside of his head. They were working together the entire time. Another common belief is that intelligence is something that you're born with, that some people are just naturally smart, and the rest of us just have to accept the hand that we were dealt. Almost like your brain has a permanent ceiling. But the truth is your brain is constantly changing. This is called neuroplasticity. When you first try something new, it can be rather difficult and feel slow and awkward. But every time you practice this new skill, the brain becomes more efficient when performing this skill. Challenging yourself forces the brain to build new pathways, which over time become faster and more efficient. Aristotle once claimed, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence is not an act, but a habit. And history is full of examples that break this idea. Thomas Edison, for example, was once told by a teacher that he was too stupid to learn anything. That same boy who was too stupid later held a total of 2,332 patents and helped shape the modern technology. Turns out early academic performance doesn't always predict long-term intelligence. So why does covering these myths really matter anyway? And the reason is because these myths about intelligence can actually affect how people live their lives. If you believe that your intelligence is fixed, you might stop challenging yourself and accept mediocrity. If you believe that IQ defines you, you might underestimate abilities that these tests never measure, or overestimate your intelligence. If you believe you're right or left-brained, you might avoid learning things you'd become great at. The amount of times that I've heard someone say, "I suck at drawing," but this statement and this belief is plastic. Of course, if you never practice a skill, you won't perform well at it. Like for me, ballerina. I've never practiced ballerina. I wouldn't expect myself to go put on a show in front of New York Broadway. And it's true, there are some skills that just takes a long time to really get a hand at. Jiu-jitsu, for example. It takes about 10 years just to get a black belt. And even getting a black belt doesn't mean necessarily that you've mastered the sport. The truth about intelligence is that it is completely moldable. Even from my own experience. I was called stupid a lot by friends, classmates, even from family members. And for a while, I believed that this was true. Looking back though, my issue was never my intelligence. I just never learned to tailor work with my brain. Once I began challenging myself and exercising my mind, things changed. The potential was always there, and it is for everyone out there. It just needs to be developed. The real truth about intelligence is how much potential people leave unused because they believe these myths about their own mind. That's why it is really crucial to stay skeptical of information, including your own beliefs. Don't rely on a single source of information. Don't jump to conclusions too quickly, because even the myths we discussed today, there are millions of people out there that genuinely believe these. For example, believing intelligence is fixed. If you believe that your brain has a limit, you might stop challenging yourself long before you discover what you're actually capable of. Because the truth is, you are far more capable than what you've been led to believe. And even if your own brain believes this. After all, millions of kids believe in Santa, but belief alone doesn't necessarily mean truth. And just because a belief may be common, also doesn't mean that it's correct. If you enjoyed this kind of breakdown, subscribe for more bangers, and make sure to hit that like button. And I'll see you guys in the next discussion. Peace out.